ਅੱਜ ਦੀ ਖਾਸ ਮਹਿਮਾਨ ਹੈ ਜੀ ਸੀਮਾ ਆਲੂਵਾਲੀਆ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕੌਂਟੀਨੈਂਟਲ ਪੋਲੀਟੈਕਨਿਕ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਪੜ੍ਹਾਉਂਦੀ ਹੈ ਮੂਲ ਵਾਸੀਆਂ ਬਾਰੇ। ਖੁਦ ਵੀ ਇੱਕ ਮੂਲ ਵਾਸੀ ਸੱਜਣ ਨੂੰ ਵਿਆਹੀ ਹੋਈ ਸੀ। ਸੋ ਸੀਮਾ ਆਲੂਵਾਲੀਆ ਨੇ ਲੰਬਾ ਸਮਾਂ ਮੂਲ ਵਾਸੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਰਹਿ ਕੇ ਕੰਮ ਕੀਤਾ। ਮੂਲ ਵਾਸੀਆਂ ਬਾਰੇ ਵਿਦਿਆਰਥੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਾਫੀ ਕੁਝ ਦੱਸਦੀ ਹੈ। ਜਦੋਂ ਮੂਲ ਵਾਸੀਆਂ ਦੀ ਲੋਕ ਲਹਿਰ ਚੱਲੀ ਸੀ ਆਈਡਲ ਨੋ ਮੋਰ, ਉਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਸ਼ਿਰਕਤ ਉਸਨੇ ਕੀਤੀ। ਸੋ ਇਸ ਸਮੇਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕੋਵੇਚਾਨ ਭਾਈਚਾਰਾ, ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿਚਾਲੇ ਤਾਂ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਦੇ ਟਕਰਾਅ ਵਾਲੀ ਸਥਿਤੀ ਬਣੀ ਹੋਈ ਹੈ ਅਦਾਲਤਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਜਿਸ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਇਹ ਬਾਤ ਦਾ ਪਤੰਗੜ ਬਣਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਕਿ ਕੋਰਟ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਹੱਕ 'ਚ ਫੈਸਲਾ ਦੇ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਇੱਥੇ ਦੀਆਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਪ੍ਰੋਪਰਟੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਉੱਪਰ ਹੁਣ ਮੂਲ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਬਜ਼ਾ ਕਰ ਲੈਣਗੇ। ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਡਰ ਖੜਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਜੌਨ ਰਸਟੈਡ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਜਾਂ ਸੱਜੇ ਪੱਖੀਆਂ ਵੱਲੋਂ। ਉਸ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਵਿਸ਼ੇਸ਼ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਸੀਮਾ ਆਲੂਵਾਲੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਸ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਤੋਂ ਪਿੱਛੋਂ। ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ ਨਵੀਂ ਤਾਜ਼ੀ YouTube ਤੇ।
3 years ago, a local distributor was drowning in orders, inventory, and finances. Then they partnered with Stratwit to implement SAP Business One. Thereafter, everything became simple, accurate, and connected. Today, they're thriving, and so can you. At Stratwit Solutions Limited, we install the market's top ERP at an affordable price.
सुषमा जी, बड़े कॉल्स आ रहे हैं और लोग बड़े परेशान हैं। कहते कि जैसे रेडियो पे हिंदी पंजाबी मिक्स गाने सुनने को मिलते थे ना हमारे यहाँ से, अब वैसे बिल्कुल रेडियो पे ऐसे गाने आते ही नहीं हैं।
तुम्हारा कहने का मतलब है कि स्पाइस रेडियो पे जैसे प्रोग्राम आते थे
एग्जैक्टली
1200 AM पे, तो वो जो प्रोग्राम थे वो हमने वो प्रोग्राम अभी भी हमारे पास हैं और वो हम उनको ले आए हैं रिमझिम पे।
मतलब सेम प्रोग्रामिंग हम सुन सकते हैं।
हाँ जी, जैसे लोगों को कल्चर ऑफ पंजाब बहुत पसंद था, वो भी हमारे पास है। नून सुकून जो हम पेश करते थे 12 बजे, वो भी है। गपशप जो हम पेश करते हैं वो भी है। इवनिंग शो जो मनशालिका करती हैं वो भी है। आफ्टरनून शो जो रिक्वेस्ट है वो भी हैं। तो ये सब कुछ रेडियो रिमझिम पे है और आप रिमझिम पे इनको सुन सकते हैं। और रिमझिम पे आप इसे हमारे रेडियो पर भी सुन सकते हैं और हमारा जो ऐप है उस पर भी आप सुन सकते हैं। तो अगर आपके पास आईफोन है तो आईफोन पे आप हमारा ऐप ले लीजिए और उसके ज़रिए आप प्रोग्राम सुन सकते हैं।
Seema ji, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me today. Pleasure to be here.
Anytime. So Seema ji, what can you briefly tell us about the case of Cowichan Tribes against the Canadian establishment?
Well, that's an interesting way of putting it. And I think the first thing that I would like to say is that Canadians need to understand that there's something called Indigenous inherent title. Indigenous peoples' rights are inherent and eternal. They do not need Canada or any other colonial agent to grant them their rights. These rights existed long before the theft and colonization of this land was a twinkle in some white supremacist colonists' eyes. And so that goes as well for the concept of underlying title. And that's another concept I hope that your listeners will consider today, is that the introduction of a private property system on this continent was for the purpose of stealing the land and building colonial establishments here. None of us were invited here by the Indigenous nations that were already here. And so the history of Canada's attempts to, overturn Indigenous peoples' jurisdictions over their territories is a long and a noble one that has been in effect ever since we've all, been here. But Canada has never been able to do it. And there are at least 4 different Supreme Court cases that have demonstrated that Canada and Britain before it has never been able to demonstrate if Indigenous title was extinguished, when and how did that happen? And it hasn't happened. And so what we're seeing is that colonial settler societies like Canada, we want to give ourselves a permanent exception to the rules of international law. And Indigenous nations on this continent have tirelessly, for hundreds of years, sought to protect their nations and sought to resist the genocide that has been imposed upon them. And again, if in case any of your listeners think that language is inflammatory, I want to let your listeners know that the definition of genocide, as most people understand it today, most people think genocide means like a mass killing, that you go into a territory and try to kill everybody. That's simply not true. The definition of genocide is the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a religious, national, or ethnical group. And so, in fact, Canada, United States, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, all of these white settler societies were deeply engaged in trying to thwart the establishment of a genocide convention that would address the actions of our own nations. And so this is articulated clearly in the research of Cree scholar Tamara Starblanket. So that's where we are today with respect to the Cowichan Tribes case. This is one of the longest running, trials in Canadian history. But what's unique about it, Gurpreet ji, is that for the first time, we have a Canadian court ruling on lands that are defined by the Canadian state as fee simple.
Right.
So this requires us to understand the way that private property is established here, and the long-running expectation of people who have come here and bought land, assuming that, they could have free tenure, a freehold kind of tenure on this land forever. And this is something now increasingly that we're seeing in various court cases that is being challenged. Now, the Cowichan Tribes case, as I said, it's been going on for many years. The ruling of Justice Young in August now, obviously we're hearing from the BC government that they're going to appeal this ruling, and there are many parties who want to appeal this ruling. And so I'll pause here just to let you ask another question, but just to let you know, the Musqueam people, the Musqueam First Nation, is also appealing this ruling. And it's interesting, I often tell my students when I want them to use scholarly research to understand whose territories we are in. And many of my students will, they'll do the low-hanging fruit. They'll go to a municipal website, and try to find out, from the performative land acknowledgement that's done there. So I pointed out to my students at our Richmond campus of Kwantlen Polytechnic University, if you go to the Richmond municipal website, you won't see any land acknowledgement. And that is because Richmond is known for many, many years
That's
that
a very interesting observation.
Canada's claim on this land is always been challenged by the people who actually own the land, and Richmond has never had a land acknowledgement because there are these cases. Musqueam is challenging Richmond's jurisdiction over this land as well. So what we really need to think about is the jurisdictional nightmares that Canada, with its provinces, has created for the many sovereign nations that existed here. And those sovereign nations have been torn asunder by Canadian law that has taken those original sovereign nations and broken them down into bits, originally referred to by Canada as tribes, and now known as First Nations.
Right. So what in your understanding is behind the knee-jerk reaction of the city of Richmond? Is it just the so-called fear of the property rights being taken away, or something more than that?
Well, I think it's more fundamentally a reflection of our greed. And I think that, it's funny this week, we celebrated a six, Bandi Chor Divas, and it's interesting to think, as those of us who are Sikhs have grown up with all the glorious stories of the sacrifices of our people to protect our land, to stay connected to our land. But this is not our land. I mean, I'm almost 65. I was born in India, but most of us know, Punjabi people, we know where our homeland is. We can still go to our homeland. And so what has happened through the process of colonial migration that has deteriorated our thoughts and feelings so much that we, as people who also suffered colonization by the British, are not able to make the connection between what the British did over there and what we are continuing to do over here. Because colonization, again, the stereotype that this was something that, happened in the past. No, it's not over. And this is what our courts are demonstrating as well. This desire of Canada to take this land is never ending. And so this backwards kind of way that we talk about Indigenous people's struggles to protect their lands, most of us know this idea of land claims. It's not Indigenous peoples. They don't have to claim their own land. It's Canada that's claiming their land.
Absolutely.
Indigenous peoples have inherent rights and underlying title. And so this knee-jerk reaction of Malcolm Brody can also be seen in the statements, for example, in John Rustad, talking to the Convention of Municipalities in August, and saying, Indigenous title cannot coexist with, individual property rights, which is the opposite of what we're supposed to be talking about with respect to reconciliation. Excuse me. And so, in fact, no Indigenous nation has ever said that they're going to kick us out of here.
Absolutely not.
But Indigenous peoples want Canadians to understand and pay attention to our history. The fact that we have been able to, as a Canadian nation, assert a fictional narrative of how we got this land. We can no longer sustain that. The silencing of Indigenous voices that has happened throughout our history, cannot be sustained in an age where, media technology allows Indigenous peoples to get their ideas out in their own voices. And so I would say, with respect to BC, listeners need to understand that most of us are in this province illegally by Canadian law, not by Indigenous people's laws. That is true as well, but by Canadian law. Because the international law holds the only way that any of us are supposed to be here is through treaty. And most of this place that we call BC is untreated. And so since the 1990s and the establishment of the so-called BC Treaty Commission, excuse me, we have continued to try and find a legal way of talking about how we own this land.
Right.
But it's important for Canadians to understand that Canada tried desperately to take the land through law. And by the 1970s, it was clear this wasn't going to happen.
Right.
So we changed track in the 1970s, and we moved from trying to extinguish Aboriginal title through law. And now we're doing it through policy. You've heard of lawfare? I would call this Canada's version policy fair, where we use federal land claim, specific lands claim policy to try and silence Indigenous people's rights. And we do this in such a way where the government says, okay, we're not going to extinguish your title, but we want to bring in disagreements that say, in exchange for having access to some of your lands and resources, you have to promise that you will never act on your Aboriginal title. And this has just made an absolutely unsustainable situation for Indigenous peoples who are really caught between a rock and a hard place. So every day, Indigenous nations are forced to face the fact that they don't have adequate resources for their people to survive. And how they navigate and negotiate that on a daily basis is something that most of us as Canadians don't really seem to know anything about.
Yeah.
And again, that speaks to the power we have as settlers.
Now, Seema, to what extent do you think the ruling NDP is also responsible for this anti-Indigenous hate we are seeing on the social media platforms? You spoke about BC Conservatives, and also you mentioned the city of Richmond, obviously. But what about the NDP? Because the premier of this province, JVTB, was other day talking about the people worried about the property rights as real people, quote unquote, real people. So that statement itself was very problematic.
At the end of the day, the NDP represents the Canadian state.
Hmm.
And so, apart from all the performative rhetoric that we've heard, the BC, Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, and all of this, it's very, very performative.
Hmm.
Because here is the BC government now saying, of course, we're going to challenge this. And of course, they're going to defend private property rights. And so this is very much a part of the national rhetoric right now as well. And so you'll have noted that since Donald Trump was elected in the United States, his tariff policy, for example, was used as an excuse by the liberals and the conservatives to mount, this Canada First agenda, where once again Canada has used legislation to strip Indigenous peoples of their rights of free and prior informed consent, suggesting that nation building, is our most important, thing that we have to take care of in this current climate. But I mean, in a way, this is really not a break from anything that we've been doing before. And we have to remember that the nation that we're talking about building is Canada. And the nations we are building over are like the 50, 60 first original nations that were already here, which have now been divided into over 650 First Nations.
Right.
But, First Nations have reminded us that their work every day is the same,
Right.
that they are doing everything to make sure that their people may live in the face of this ongoing colonization,
Right.
and that they want to continue to exist as nations,
Hmm.
not just as, Native Canadians, which is often the discourse presented through discussions of reconciliation.
Now, Seema, you must have noticed on the social media, some of the commentators went to the extent of mocking the custom of land acknowledgement.
Yeah,
What does
yeah.
this tell us about the Canadian society?
It's a reminder that this society is built on the foundation of racism,
Hmm.
and that most people don't understand white supremacy as a global system of dispossessing Indigenous peoples around the world of their land. And, one of the things that really concerns me right now is, that number 6 road, where some of this land that the Cowichan tribes have asserted their title over. If you drive down number 6 road, you'll see there's many Punjabi people, there's many Chinese people who have homes there. And really, what are we doing any different from the white settlers who were here before us? We're still trying to take the land. And we don't want to look too deeply at history unless we take the position of victim. Like, for example, the current discourse of, equity, diversity, and inclusion is something that I disavow. For me, it's really about talking about equal access of diverse settlers to be able to colonize and exploit Indigenous peoples' lands and territories. That's not my struggle, you know. And so I recall elders from, my husband's nation. My late husband was Sichangu Lakota. So their territories include the Black Hills, and they are now occupied by, South Dakota. And I remember an elder, talking about what they thought about the settlers. And, she said, well, I guess these people couldn't resolve their problems in their own country. So now they've come here and they brought all their problems here.
Hmm.
And, my husband always expressed that, they want us foreigners, and that includes all of us people who descended from other nations for however many generations we've been here, that on this continent there exist many systems of law of the original nations. There exist systems of international law because these nations knew each other, shared territories with each other, developed peace and friendship agreements with each other, traded all the way from Alaska to, Florida, have intermarried with like Polynesian and Hawaiian nations over many generations. And yes, the Coast Salish peoples here, have, amazing watercraft that have been able to make ocean-going journeys. All of this reality is denied by a colonial narrative of history,
Right.
which really springs from, in the first instance, a Christian nationalist imperative. The colonization of European nations began with the ideology that, Christians have the God-given right to take over the world. It is their manifest destiny. And this idea continued until, as we're reaching the so-called Age of Enlightenment, as they call it in Europe, and as we say in the Western world today. Scientific knowledge becomes, more important than religious knowledge. Suddenly in Europe, it is no longer tenable to use religion as a justification for all the dispossession that's going on through colonization. And so the same white Christian males, who are the inheritors of these empires, are also the ones who created this discourse and the pseudoscience of race.
Right.
So white Christian nationalists are refigured as the supreme race.
Right.
And now we have this civilizing narrative, right? That, oh, these poor backwards people, the white man is going to bring us the light. And that kind of narrative has been used by Canada to really kind of create this narrative that we are like benevolent, benefactors trying to uplift, Native peoples.
Right.
When in reality, like we have just brought genocide and harm that they are still trying to survive.
Absolutely. Well, Seema ji, it was nice talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything I didn't ask you before I let you go?
I think that Canadians should consider, as certainly as Sikhs, we know how to do this. I was brought to believe up that my people believe in everybody's spiritual freedom. I was taught, that we fight for the freedom of others, as Sri Hari Gobind did,
Yeah.
helping to free all of those princes. And so I want Canadians today to recognize that we have created a jurisdictional nightmare. And I'm just waiting to see how the NDP or the Conservatives or others are going to try to pit the Musqueam against the Cowichan tribes, because obviously the Musqueam are appealing this as well. But I think that Canadians should realize that the tactic of divide and conquer is left, again, the nations of these territories in a position where, in order to even sit at a treaty table, they had to define their territories and ultimately were made to fight against each other. Now, you can imagine what used to be like one unit, one sovereign nation, broken into bits. Is now having to fight for their rights and their territories, and often fighting against their own relatives. And that's just the way that colonizers like it.
Absolutely.
So this story will continue to develop.
No, definitely talk to you again, Seema ji.
Thank
Thanks
you
for your
so
time.
much.